Hello, and welcome to the University of Utah Guest Writer Series. I'm Alan Borst, the administrator of the Creative Writing program here at the U. Before we begin our event with Miranda Mellis, we want to acknowledge that this land upon which the university is located and which is named for the Ute tribe is the traditional and ancestral homeland of the Shoshone, Paiute, Goshute, and Ute tribes. The University of Utah recognizes and respects the enduring relationship that exists between many indigenous peoples and their traditional homelands. We respect the sovereign relationship between tribes, states, and the federal government, and we affirm the University of Utah's commitment to a partnership with Native nations and urban Indian communities through research, education, and community outreach activities. Let me now introduce Jackie Balderrama, who will tell you more about today's event.
Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Guest Writer Series. I'm Jackie Balderrama, the Administrative Fellow helping coordinate this series with Creative Writing Administrator Alan Borst. This evening, we're very happy to be joined by Miranda Mellis. For tonight's program, we will begin with an introduction by Eric Blix, after which Miranda Mellis will read. She will then engage in a conversation moderated by University of Utah professor Lindsay Drager. We'll conclude with a Q&A from select graduate students, then open it up to everyone. Please note that the Q&A function has been enabled at the bottom of your screen. Feel welcome to share any questions for Miranda there. Also know this event is being recorded and will be made available on the U of U English YouTube channel. We encourage you to purchase books by the guest writer at your local bookstore. A link to purchase The Spokes at King's English Bookstore here in Salt Lake City will be posted in the chat momentarily. The Guest Writer Series was made possible through the University of Utah English Department and received funding from Salt Lake County Zoo Arts and Parks Program and Utah Humanities. Utah Humanities empowers groups and individuals to improve their communities through active engagement in the humanities. This series is also supported in part by Utah Arts and Museums, with funding from the state of Utah and the National Endowment for the Arts. I'd like to invite Eric Blix to turn on his camera and mic as he introduces Miranda Mellis.
Hello, everyone. Our guest writer tonight is Miranda Mellis. Mellis teaches fiction, nonfiction, contemporary literature, and ecological humanities at the Evergreen State College in Olympia, Washington. She is the author of numerous books and chapbooks, including The Revisionist from Calamari Archive, None of This is Real from Sidebrow, The Spokes from Solid Objects, The Instead from Carville Annex, and as of this coming June, Demystifications, also from Solid Objects. She holds an MFA in Literary Arts from Brown University and a BA in Writing and Literature from Naropa University. She writes a quarterly column for The Believer and co-founded and co-edited the Encyclopedia Project, which can be found at encyclopediaproject.net. Heteroglossic, paratactic, and fabulistic, Mellis's books show us worlds that can't possibly exist, but to our great horror cannot be denied. These are places where an anonymous bureaucrat can assume the eye of God, which is also the eye of the state, and watch the fallout of a nuclear blast from the sequestered heights of an abandoned lighthouse, then write an official report declaring radioactive dust to be perfectly harmless. Mellis's works dive headfirst into the twisting contradictions of life inside complex information societies. Directed by moral clarity and progressive political commitments, they refrain from collapsing into the same old postmodern critiques of global empire. These are stories where irony is not enough. Saturated with rage, sincerity, playfulness, and wonder, these are books that task us with more than just facing the brute injustices of our own world. They compel us to dream of the alternatives. Please join me in welcoming Miranda Mellis to the Guest Writers Series.
Thank you so much, Eric, for that beautiful introduction. Welcome, everyone. So happy to be here. I'm speaking to you from Olympia, from the traditional lands of the Medicine Creek Treaty tribes, which include the Squaxin Island tribe, the Nisqually Indian tribe, and the Puyallup tribe of Indians. I wanted to thank Alan, Jackie, Lindsay, and Michael, as well as Eric again for this introduction and for having me. We were going to do this in person some time ago, and I'm glad that we're finally able to do it. I'm going to read from my forthcoming book, which Eric just mentioned, Demystifications, for about 5 minutes, and then I'll read from a novel in progress. So this is the book that's coming out in June, Demystifications, and this is the epigraph from Fanny Howe. How can something add up when it is only conceived and then understood in reverse, by subtracting until a lot of it is gone? Epic fail, novel fail, aphorism fail, like when an ant loses control of its mandible and drops the torso of a wasp. Your silence feels vindictive. Maybe you're just busy feeling hostile. You're angry because I've misunderstood you. You're angry because I've understood you. Your revenge will be to make yourself too important to reply, but it won't work. I've known you too long. That is to say, you're already too important to me. Your new importance means nothing to the ones who love you best. I'll take my small talk dry. Cassie has had an astrological chart done for the credit rating system, which was originated by an abolitionist. Apparently, the credit rating system's Chiron is in Cancer. Her alternative credit rating agency grants you credence by asking, what's your real story? The commodity is human labor in the abstract. Appearing seamless, it seems to lack sediment, as if it emanated as miracle from its point of sale. About those who would seem to know too much too soon, Kathy Weeks cautions, quote, there are advantages, I claim, to more partial visions of alternatives, fragments or glimpses of something different that do not presume to add up to a blueprint of an already named future with a preconceived content. Cognition, the ignited cog, is all thinking in part magical thinking. Biodiversity, a communism of non-equivalence. Another idea for a TV show, it's called Office Hours. Every episode, someone different coming to office hours. Edward Said wrote, regard all experiences as if they were about to disappear. So those are a few of the demystifications in this book of 99 demystifications out from Solid Objects in June. And now I'm going to read for the remainder of my time from a book I'm writing called Two Problems, a Trilogy. Inhaling the scent of rain pounding, I fall asleep on the couch with the window open, and I sleep many hours, as is my wont these days. I dreamed the house was sliding into a ravine and woke in a torpor to find myself sliding off the couch and the sky darkened by downpour. I went outside to observe the wide rivulets that puncture the ground, numberless tiny waterfalls sweeping the soil downhill particle by particle. The land is deluged, becoming a slippery clay. There's no denying the house is sliding. It presents itself eternally, full for me with memory, but now I see its future and mine falling over the edge. And as every object will be thrown from its customary place, tools, appliances, clothes, chairs, dishes, art, books, tables, windows, crashing, breaking, flying, decontextualized and strewn, scattered, trashed, undone. Will these objects not find their tentative disbelief and mystifying way of floating non-committally 1 inch in the air was always justified? Is there anything that is not unsettled? Perhaps this wet hand that is digging away under the house has designs more important than mine, as I have never known where things should be anyway, and have always sensed a vast disorder very near. When the land is logged and stripped, monocropped, extracted, root systems that held the soil in place, once embraced in a strong weave, is deconstructed, the soil grows flighty, rootless, and it runs away. Root systems take weight, give all its meaning to the word, the concept of weight, for earth is gravity itself, is grave, so why hate death or growing down? Mountains are a risen weight, seas are bowls of weight bearing weight, tsunamis break new lines between the land and sea, mountains break open and the land slides down, a mountain buries itself. A house is a habitable hill. We contemporaries inherit the aesthetics of the fragment. Everyone born after the atom bomb, after Oppenheimer et al., and after the 20th century's dying empires fantasied into being an imaginary cut-up of a world of lines in the sand, lines through lands as if history began with them. Around here, it's very clear-cut. The mountains are sliding because of logging, because of the 19th century settler colonial cult of the clear cut. For those of us who came after, why we begin at the end. War and its art forms are our tradition. The wars move around, sometimes distant, sometimes near, sometimes right here. We inherit permanent war, war as series, as chapter book, as season. World War I, World War II. If it is a series, then war is our horizon. Mayakovsky wrote, a change of plane from that in which an action or fact is situated, a certain distance is indispensable. You have to stand back. If you don't do that, you simply won't see the thing. The bigger the thing or the event, the further you have to get away from it. My mother, also a Bolshevik, would have recommended being objective about the house sliding into the ravine because it's objective. She would say, you can solve it. I agree, but not objectively. Sometimes sitting at the bottom of the ravine, which threatens to change the plane of my house, I feel a change of plane stealing over my spirit, a careless happiness, and I don't mind what happens. A silent comedy laughs through me. The erosion of the ravine mirrors the slow decay of my own sensibilities and hopes. A cedar branch leans over me like a concerned friend. We wish our disasters were small, the scale of a broken dish, say, but we live on a planet where continents break and drift. After a storm, a big leaf maple exploded. 3 enormous moss-covered limbs crashed down, bringing light to the hill. The human idea of repair just doesn't apply. For trees, death is not a conclusion, but a coming and a going. Though less flamboyant than a living tree with its chatty little leaves eager for light, the dead tree has more living tissue in it. The snag is the favorite armature of eagles. Imperceptible myriads feast on dead trees, proliferating so much that seemingly dead trees are ever more densely packed with living cells. Sacrificial tree. Ancient cultures felt that sacrificing kings turned the seasons. There was prescience in this idea that the future depends upon the death of rulers. We are in their company, the ancients. We are their people, being mortal. We're in the company of them and dogs and bats and butterflies who never did dwell in an animal kingdom, who are also buried in green capes of moss and lichen, folded into a flowering underworld of bones, species, debris, becoming insects, rocks, fossils. One pocket of soil has millions of organisms where we do not see them. There are the animalcules repairing invisibly in opaque, boiling vents of the world garden. The cow cannot digest grass or the termite lignin without their bacterial communities to do it for them. Nothing living is not symbiotic, emergent of this mutual reciprocity. It must be said, there is no higher pragmatism. Wave after wave of symbionts, fold after fold, plying each other over millennia. Retrospectively from afar, plots look planned, formal, static, inevitable, explicatable, to explicate from ply. Close up are so many uncertain actions, indecisive horizons, chaotic with upturned plans. There's a cemetery at the bottom of the ravine. No one has been buried there for a generation. It is just part of the unsanctimonious land now, the microbial earth. I walk up and down, traverse the ravine to see if it can tell me how to prevent the house from sliding right off its foundation onto the cemetery, which is to be avoided for obvious reasons. As well as one reason which isn't obvious. Most reasons aren't obvious. The obvious is rarely truly obvious. Even the uncanny equations that show our universe has the properties of a hologram are spoken of in the non-mood of obviousness, but the closer you look, nothing is. Take the sea in our bodies, our scapula like the wings of seabirds, our backs fluid and bony, just like a rocky creek along which time has braided a spine. That things are not obvious is obvious. Even the obvious reason that one should prevent a house sliding into a ravine isn't. Why shouldn't it slide into a ravine? The earth, after all, exists in an abyss. The non-obvious reason is the cemetery. And if it's obvious to say a house shouldn't slide off its foundations into a ravine, it's even more obvious to say a house shouldn't fall onto a cemetery, as convenient as that might be for me, should I happen to be in the house at that moment, getting me right to the point. We hang a curtain on this side of that abyss. We wrap ourselves in love, which arises as a balm for dying. Photographs once sealed onto headstones, now effaced, ambiguously swirling. To be forgotten, to be unknown is to be as abstract as a whirl of grain. One limb of the fallen maple took down a statue of Mother Mary as it fell. The dismembered tree and the cracked mother lie side by side, two crumbling, hollowing cylinders. Around them labor ants by their hundreds, yet each one discreet, itself working, pulling sticks, pine needles, sometimes the torn remains of other insects to a teeming hill, a rustling, clicking mound, sometimes pausing to share information of food, antenna entangled, a ceaseless coming and going. I come and go too ceaselessly along the path that flows up and down the ravine, up to the faltering ridge, down to the abandoned cemetery, back up again to the house once blue, now gray, with rotted trim, a mossy roof, and a large picture window with a taped up crack. Were you to look into the window with the taped up crack, initially a single crack, which has branched over the years into 3 cracks, you would see me at my table reading, looking at the trees, trying to solve my problems. I sit here at the table and take their measure, these problems. I probe them, try to see where they are coming from and where they are going to. I need to define them in their particularity, such as the problem of this falling house, as well as generally, what do I mean by problem, qua problem, a word with Latin and Greek origins, from problema, headland, promontory, thing put forward, from pro, forward, and balein, to throw. So it turns out I mean the same thing by problem in general and my problem in particular, at least my first problem, because they are the same thing if a problem is a thing thrown. And it may be the same thing, problem generally, problem qua problem, as my second problem as well, which can also be fairly described as originally a thing thrown, insofar as that problem too begins with a projection, a literal projection, the projection of a film upon a wall. That is, both my problems have the qualities of a projection. A problem, then, is always intimately temporal. No problem is not a problem of time and therefore of purpose. If one's purpose is one's problem is certainly one's purpose, like it or not. Certainly my problems give me purpose. The question is whether I can fulfill this purpose by solving my problems. Without these problems, what would my purpose be? Do I fail to solve these problems because without them, I would have no purpose? Or do I fail to solve these problems because I can't face the fact that even if I accept that they are my purpose and do my best to solve them, I will not solve them. I will never solve them, which will then have meant that my life was lived in the pursuit of the irresolvable. My life will have been an unsolved problem, a thing thrown, a ball that is never caught, a house that is always falling, a life that is always disappearing. There are problems that come from in front, pressing you back. These problems force you to think ahead. There are problems that come from behind, pushing you forward. These problems force you to think again. The problem of the house sliding comes from the future and the past. It comes from below and it comes from behind. It comes from all directions. It is both on its way and already here. Every problem that has not already manifested as an event that is encroaching but conceivable to forestall has this duality. If a problem is from the past and as of yet unsolved, a problem with a long half-life, a problem that remains a problem for generations, this means that the usual methods of problem solving from the past will not work, as evidently they have not worked. For such a problem, the future is not the future, but a repetition of the past, the falling, perishing, crumbling past. Only when the problem comes to an end, only then can it be said that the future has arrived, when the problem becomes a memory, a story. Only problems that have become stories can be called the past. When problems have turned into stories told to future generations as in once upon a time, they carry no foreboding. If, on the other hand, a problem beckons from the future in the form of signs and auguries, that problem can only be solved by reading those signs and auguries accurately and acting accordingly. One must determine the ratio of thought to action for a given problem. There are problems that are solved with thought and problems that are solved with action. Some would say thinking is an action. There are, of course, thoughts that cause events. Perhaps all thoughts cause events, are events, as ceaseless and countless as a teeming anthill. Thoughts projected, thought projects. Some are able to project their thoughts into the world with so much force and intention that it is entirely altered. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. Beautiful, beautiful reading. Thank you so much for that fantastic reading, Miranda. I'm so excited to have you here. I can share with everyone that long ago, I invited Miranda on to join me for a panel at AWP, a writers conference. Our panel was canceled and the panel was about failure. So Miranda brilliantly pointed out that only can a panel on failure succeed by not getting accepted. So thank you so much for letting me sort of rethink that experience. And I'm so thrilled to have you here in this digital space, even if not in person. Such a beautiful, haunting reading. I have a couple questions for you, and then we'll invite some grad students in. In the meantime, I'll ask anyone out there in the ether to please submit your question in the chat. My first question, Miranda, has to do with sort of the role of speculation and the speculative. And I'm thinking about this, you know, you're such a dynamic, diverse writer. You're so invested in sort of hard science. You're also playing with fable and fairy tale and these other sorts of, you know, science fiction, noir, so many of these other genres. And I'm really just, I'm curious about how you see or think about speculation, both in this kind of speculative fiction way, but also in terms of your essay work as, you know, speculations, curiosity as a fueling function for the work that you do in the essay form. And also just to speak to this last piece in this new project, which is so exciting and so beautiful and haunting. You know, what might the role of speculative fiction be in thinking about the enormous, the climate crisis that is in front of us and the future more largely? So that's sort of my opening question.
Thank you so much, Lindsay. It's wonderful to remember that the success of our failed panel on failure. Well, this character, the narrator of Two Problems, a trilogy, is in a speculative situation with regards to the fate of their house. They are, at once they can see that the house is losing its foundations, and yet it hasn't happened yet, right? So this temporal space of speculation, that it's a heuristic position to speculate, and to imagine what might happen if this, and what might happen if that. I think the thing about the kind of this story in so far as it is structured as a metonymically in relation to climate change, both as an actual symptom of climate change, because these small and local events that affect people, such as when people might lose their house, or in a mudslide or a fire or things like this, or be forced to leave the place that they live because of desertification or things like this, are felt in the body in this immediate way, and are linked to the large biosphere. So so in this sense, it's this is not, in some ways, not speculative, like this house is falling, right? But the speculative is there something, and there's, you know, another problem that this character is sort of struggling with, that has to do with changing things in such a way that, you know, but they're sort of in this position where there's so much that they can't see and can't know, right? There's just this fundamental contradiction and complexity of knowing and not knowing at the same time. And I think, to finally get to your question, I think this is where the speculative becomes so ethically appealing, and as, you know, a way to kind of open a space of possibility, where it's sort of like if there's a sense in which our fate is overdetermined, then to incorporate what we don't know, or what is unknowable or not known, just to bring that in is to open up the possibility of more indeterminate, you know. So for example, one might speculate, as I have with a group of neighbors for some time, in a kind of almost hopeful, in a way that's both hopeful and hopeless. What would it be like if the commercial logging wasn't happening around here, and all the concomitant harms of clear cutting, and keep talking to each other and speculating and daring to ask, you know, more, a little bit more, like, you know, pushing against the norms of that, you know, the sort of inherited terrible norms of that. And then suddenly something starts to give, and bits of the forest are now protected. And then suddenly there's this, and it's happening because many people are doing this in many places. There's a lawsuit in Washington State to stop logging in this manner. So I think that we want to, more and more, it seems that people are, you know, with collections like Octavia's Brood and other projects, linking speculative fiction to political work and to ethical work and to social change, that these stories are not just, we're not just consuming literature. We're opening space for possibilities of change. And that is really exciting.
Yeah. And I see so much of that, that in your past work, you know, so this kind of synthesis of, on the one hand, serious kind of social justice issues surfacing, and investment in that, but kind of wedded with this like theoretical whimsy that really does make space for the imagination in these very concrete, realist problems that we have in front of us. I think that's one of the things that's really drawn me to your work. And this kind of dovetails into my second question, which is kind of about collaboration. I love the way this syncs up with your discussion with your neighbors. You you have edited 3 volumes of the Encyclopedia Project, which is such a magical, fascinating undertaking, collaborative editing experience, and also kind of an invitation from tons of different writers to kind of define various different terms. I know that you collaborate in teaching at Evergreen, and I know that you do sort of outreach work as well. And so I was just kind of curious if you could speak a little bit to the role of collaboration in your process and in your practice as a writer, thinker, human.
Thank you. Yeah, co-laboring, laboring together. Team teaching is really wonderful. We get to be learners, co-learners. I had opportunities to teach with forest ecologists and biogeochemists and filmmakers, and so I sort of get to be in this constant learning place, and so that collaboration is that's how that is. It's where teaching and learning are the same thing. They really are the same, and there's an intimacy to that. And then with the editorial work, I was just looking at this is the 3rd volume of Encyclopedia. Just looking at it today because I'm working with some students on an editorial practicum and they're figuring out what they want to do. So I was looking at this and yeah, wow. I think that collaboration really came out of a question, feels like such a long time ago now. In 2006, I think we started with Tisa Bryant and Kate Schatz of asking what's not already out there in terms of literary journals. And it was really such a pleasure and such a joy, and it was very inseparable from friendship. So I think some collaborations really, that's a special, beautiful, magical thing when you can bring those things together. And I don't think it happens all that often, that it's both, that you both have this kind of rich friendship and you're able to do really creative cultural work together. And then I suppose the latest thing I'm collaborating on is sort of this very surprising and kind of unintended arising collaboration with neighbors, which seems to come really from, it's very new experience for me. I grew up in a city, I've lived in cities my whole life, and now I'm living in this rural area, and I have come to know my neighbors in a way that is not that familiar from childhood, and so there's a kind of project or work together to care for and steward the open space and the habitat around here, and that's very difficult. But I learn a lot from particularly the elderly people who have so much experience with these woods. Yeah. So I don't know if that exactly answers your question, but I think I'll say one more thing about collaboration. I think it's such a, it's so healing to collaborate, I think, because we're in this competitive, individualistic kind of enculturation. And when you start collaborating with people, you feel the burden of campaigning for your ego. You can finally put it down. You can stop the campaign, that you're supposed to be obligated to, in our sort of constantly capitalizing or something. And it's I think, really so nice to stop doing that. And because there's a humility, and that is very liberating. And in that collaborative space, of equality. So I think it's a balm, BALM, and it's also very wonderful for writers who can get a bit isolated.
Yeah, and I feel, to some extent, I feel like just talking. I mean, this is a collaboration for me. I'm so excited to be in conversation with you and to have the ability to be, you know, inviting you into our space here. And really that I feel like there's going to be even more of an investment in this sort of communal coming together for healing after whatever comes next post-pandemic. I'm going to remind folks to please put those questions in the Q&A, and I will now invite Christine Allen on to ask a question. You may unmute yourself, Christine.
Hi. Sorry, I have my weird picture up. Is that okay?
Wonderful. I love it.
Okay. So just really quick before I move on to my question, your talk about collaboration, and that was a great question, by the way. Your talk about collaboration reminds me a lot of Audre Lorde's cancer journals and her healing through community. And not to sound scandalous or something, but at the way she positions the erotic and the uses of the erotic, which is one of my favorite pieces to read. That idea of something not being singular, but an entanglement and a working together that brings about newness. Anyway, so I just want to say I'm so happy to be able to talk to you because this is right. I mean, your work addresses the issues that I'm dealing with mine right now, and I started a hybrid work of nonfiction and speculative fiction. And speculative fiction is not anything I've ever done. And I haven't been much of a reader of it either. And over the past 2 years, my ideas about how to think about the real and the surreal and so on have changed because of the political environment. And I just want to refer back to an interview you did in 2013 with Green Apple about none of this is real. So you define real in that interview. You say one definition of the real is that it is a delimitation of that which is legible and perceptible to a given being. And correct me at any time if I'm wrong, but you point out that interpreting what's real within an epistemological crisis, in this case through the epistemologies of occultists, create this landscape where realistic okay, so let me start over. That sounds confusing. So at odds here is political discourse, which is inaccessible to the disenfranchised, so to speak. And so the character needs an alternative epistemology for accessing knowledge, right? And uses a kind of dream logic as a recourse. And you added that, for my part, the purely imaginary is part of the real. It seems to me there are many realisms. One can always ask, who's real, which one? And okay, I know exactly how I would respond to that before the last couple of years. But considering that we're in our own epistemological crisis with the MAGA mind and the conspiracy theories and so forth, they do espouse a kind of dream logic, a kind of hybridity, a kind of horizontal discourse that you point out that the encyclopedia has. It's a sort of rather collaborative thing. And my concern is both about myself and about writers in general is whether there'll be within the arts a challenge to that kind of dream logic, a backlash where people feel the need to reach for the real news, you know, the real and real news instead of fake news, the singular narrative that's verifiable. And even as I taught my students over the course about how to find good resources that were reliable and stuff, I found myself appealing to vertical hierarchies of knowledge within academia, which I know to be part of the problem of social injustice. I mean, it's very much still a reinforcer of certain kinds of thinking, certain hierarchical kinds of thinking that disenfranchise some and silence some. And so my question is, that was really a long way around, I'm sorry. So my question is, how do you see things like hybridity or dream logic, this kind of thing, working in a way that doesn't have the destructive, I mean, it seems like the political discourse and conspiracy theory have combined on the same team that locks up kids in cages and so forth. So how do creatives counter that with, do you understand what I'm getting at, since I'm doing a terrible job of?
No, you're doing a wonderful job. It's such a complex, it requires everything you're saying. It's really, so I thank you. Yeah, I wanted to say about the Audre Lorde piece, you know, that moment in that text when she describes the kernel, you know, she uses a metaphor from, I think, from childhood of a kind of kernel, the erotic as this kernel that goes into the butter that, you know, suffuses it or something. And I just,
yes,
it was just, that always stayed with me too. Yeah, that has always stayed with me. That kind of question of like, or another image for that is sort of the notion of like, you know, there's a tarot card where there's one cup at the top and there's cups all along. And once the one cup is filled, all the other cups are filled, you know, because they overflow. And if the one cup isn't filled, then the other cups aren't. I always think of those things together, that kernel. But as for the epistemological crisis and the sort of way in which the Trump cosmology sort of takes up the terrible, a terrible surrealism by positing things like alternative facts. I mean, one thought that came to mind is just this notion that we embrace that there isn't, while there isn't a pre-given world that we kind of enter into, but in fact that our perception is always there, you know, our perceiving body is always there constructing the world, whether we're a bat or a dog or a whale or a person. That doesn't mean that there aren't facts. And I think, you know, Bruno Latour has that piece, has Critique run out of steam? And there, I think he speaks about the need to care again about the construction of scientific facts, and to know that things are made and constructed and labored over is not to say that then we can't trust anything, right? But it's what are the processes by which we, and criteria and, confirmations and that we use to construct our understanding. Because I think it's even true, in neuroscience and so forth, and brain science, like our perception is something that is said to be something that we're always constructing in some sense, but we have to understand that we're participating in that, but that doesn't mean that the world is just this subjective place only, right? So yeah, I hope that gets at some of what you're asking.
So maybe to keep the conversation turning to self-reflective moments in which you're pointing to the constructedness of something, because that's something you won't find the conspiracy theorists doing. They're always trying to validate.
Exactly, right? And if you have an ethical commitment to reflexivity, as you just said, I think that's so, yeah. Then you're sort of saying, what am I bringing here, right? And thus, all these important conversations about questions of bias and projections. And, it's one of the things that my character in this novel, Two Problems, is thinking about is this, and there's a narrative thread around projection and kind of literalizing the notion of projection. And so I think that commitment to action and reflection, praxis, as opposed to that sort of, I refuse to think about this. I'm accepting a way of seeing things, and I refuse to think about it. I just take it on board, right? There's a rigidity to that, there's a kind of, and so it's not that we should just, everything is moral relativism or something, or everything is uncertain and therefore, but no, I think we can take much better, more useful, and even beautiful lessons from constructivism than that.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Excellent. Thank you so much for that question, Christine, and fantastic answer, Miranda. I'm going to invite Daniel to jump on board here with his question.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for coming, Miranda. I hope it's all right if I call you Miranda.
Yeah.
My question is definitely related to both Lindsay's first question and Christine's, but I'm still going to ask it because I'm interested in this conversation. I want to keep it going. It's more, and you kind of partially answered it. I mean, this question of reflexivity, I think, is a helpful answer for me, but thinking about really the hard ethical concerns surrounding not just speculative fiction, but the mechanisms of language itself. I hate to move too far away from the present day, which I've been so entranced by your recent work, but while reading The Revisionist, I really was struck by how many of its themes have accelerated in the last 14 years or so. I mean, both on the one hand, the revisionism of fake news or alternative facts kind of rising to a fever pitch, but also, and this is maybe a little more novel in terms of this conversation, thinking about how the pandemic and the rise of smartphones, particularly since that time, has forced us to confront the disconnect of sensation to a point that maybe has surpassed where it used to be, or at least is expressing itself differently. I mean, especially in the last 12 months where Zoom has had to serve as a total replacement for human interaction. It really, that drives that disconnect between kind of the sensation of both kind of bodily, but beyond that a little bit as well. So I guess I'm just really interested, to the extent that language itself has gotten us into these problems, what is it? how might language get us out? So if literature is the medium of fake news, and we know that media is the source of sensory disconnect, are those problems? And where does that leave the ethical writer who has to do both literature and media to overcome these things that seem to be potentially inherent? And I'm making a lot of claims here, and I would love, feel free to also just grab any claim and push back on that as well. But to the extent that literature is the medium of fake news, you do need writing to do that, and you do need media to have a kind of disconnect. How does a job, are we all revisionists basically? Is that okay? Is that good? Should we become carrot farmers, for example? Is it fundamentally against, if we want connection and if we want, true news and not fake news, are we in the wrong game from the start? I'm just curious to see, how these questions have evolved for you in the last 14 years or so. Thank you so much.
Gosh, thank you, Daniel and Christine. These questions are so amazing. I really, really thank you and appreciate the depth of thought. And I'm learning from your questions. Some things that come to mind, this Zoom time, it occurred to me the other day that we might return to the body without organs, the Deleuzian reading, or the readings on faciality. Just here we are, and I suspect you know that I'm here three-dimensionally, but the philosophy of mind, maybe we need philosophy of body, right? Like we have to remember and imagine that everybody is there, three-dimensionally in their world. We have to remember that while we're in this kind of incorporeal dialogue. As far as the sort of problem of literature in this moment, so I think to return to kind of maybe the notion of ethics and making ethical judgments, right? Like we'd say, I don't know, remember when The Sopranos was such a big deal? Sopranos came around, and then the main character, who was a murderer, went into therapy. You remember this? And it was sort of, there was something novel about it, right? And it was kind of in the beginning of this sense of like this renaissance in television, and there was something very comedic about it and very literary about it, about this notion of this mafia boss going to therapy. But I think there's a way that we can say, well, what does something like that do? It says that the idea of a murderer going to therapy is it's just literature. It's merely literature. It's merely storytelling, right? And that therefore character flaws, like that murder is just a character flaw or something like that, right? That storytelling, and I'm not trying to be moralistic, I enjoyed the show too, but I'm trying to address your question by saying, so when we are consuming literature or television, which is sort of today's literature in a lot of ways, or a hugely expanded domain of storytelling, that we ask, just as we have asked of novels and problematized, what are the effects and what's being left out and what's being normalized, and what's being then sort of what's the effect on sort of our cultural and social decision making, and I think we just have to keep asking those questions. And I think, so for me, there's a contradiction there, right? If I am just consuming with pleasure this form of representation and not thinking critically about what it's saying, then that raises all the old questions about what it means to encounter a text that asks you to think, and what it means to consume a text frictionlessly. And so I think in some ways, we might, maybe we would sort of want now more than ever, difficult texts. I don't know. Nobody wants to necessarily embrace that, but I wonder, you know, things that would make us stop and kind of reflect on what, speaking of construction, what's being constructed here, and what, especially insofar as, does it lend itself to, frankly, engagement, you know, participation, and yeah.
I think that's so fascinating, the idea of, you know, literary friction as a kind of substitute for human engagement, human interaction. And I think that also does connect to Christine's earlier point about reflexivity and kind of a critical awareness really being important to how we manage the situation as well. So that helps a lot. Thank you so much, Miranda.
Thank you.
Thank you, Daniel. We have a couple more minutes, and what I'm hoping we might be able to do is maybe combine some of the questions here in the chat. We have three questions, or two questions rather. One of our questions is about none of this is real. Someone engaged with it. You can pull up your Q&A if you haven't, and it's stuck with this person ever since. What brought you to write something like this? What would you say is the relationship between the track of your life and the writing you put into the world? And maybe I'll just kind of combine that with the other question, which is about publication or making public. Thoughts or feelings about various kinds of publication that you've done as an editor, but also as a writer. So maybe you could talk specifically about none of this is real, but then also more largely about your relationship with, you know, being a writer in the world, and then also putting work into the public domain.
Yeah, thank you so much for these questions. When I was writing None of This Is Real, I found myself, you know how this is when you're working, sometimes you just, over a period of time, maybe a year or 2 years or a decade, you sort of keep circling back to certain questions. And at that time, it was really for me this kind of question of how trauma and magical thinking go together. So how, and so sort of, I felt that you ask here, what brought you to write something like this? I just really kept having these kind of characters and situations coming to me where there's this sense in which magical thinking has this, oh, that's just magical thinking, you know, it's sort of a form of thought that is, you know, proscribed. And for me, there was a way that I was trying to think, like, how could it be an affordance and really useful? And these characters, especially in that book, young people, children and young people, using magical thinking to construct a way through and out of a trauma or a traumatic situation. And so those are parables, and those are allegories in a way of storytelling itself. I think of them that way. I mean, not to say what they are in some grand way, but I think for me, that was what that was meditating on. And so now I feel a different set of preoccupations and questions are arising for me. And in terms of publishing, I think I have just found, I think there's something on the order of 35,000 small presses. Maybe somebody could correct me on that. There used to be, there might be a lot less now, there might be a lot more. There's just this world of small presses where people who are doing these presses who are so communicative and collaborative, and you can work together to create something, and it's very, I don't know, it's convivial. And so I think that sort of, I fell into that early on, and it's just sort of remained, but I don't have anything at all against, it says, are there ways to connect with a wider public that you would feel would be against your ethics? I don't feel that way, no. I think it's just sort of happened that this has been the realm in which I've found community and kind of been working, yeah.
Excellent, fantastic questions from the audience, thank you all so much for participating. Thank you so much to Eric for our intro, to Christine and Daniel for their graduate student questions, Jackie and Alan for organizing this event. Miranda Mellis, finally, I got to see with you and be in conversation with you. Thank you so, so much. I feel like this was a success, even if our panel was a failure. So thank you so much for being, thank you so much for being here with us. Thank you all, the participants. I'm gonna wrap things up. So please be safe and have a marvelous weekend. We will see you in the fall for the rest of our guest writer series. And until then, farewell, everyone.
Thank you so much. Be well.